Hello, my name is Mara Bauermeister. I am a law student at Lewis and Clark Law School, and I'm here interviewing Professor Juliet Stumpf. Um, Professor Stumpf, can you tell us a little bit about the work that you do?
Sure. I am a law professor at Lewis and Clark Law School, and I write and teach about immigration law, especially about the intersection of criminal and immigration law.
So we went down to the Tijuana border near San Diego in January of this year, and I wanted to ask Professor Stumpf a few questions about the experience that we had down there. So Professor Stumpf, can you tell me why you and some of the law students from Lewis and Clark decided to go down to Tijuana?
Yes, Mara. So what happened was the Trump administration has put into place a number of policies that has really pushed the question of immigration and restrictions on immigration across the border to places like Tijuana and El Paso. And so, as professor and law students, we thought it was really important to go and work with people who are at the border and see if we could make a difference.
Can you describe what it was like and how some of the administration's policies relate to the situation at the border in Tijuana?
Yes. So the Trump administration put into place two policies in particular. One is a policy called metering, in which people who are coming to the border to seek asylum can't come across except in small numbers. So every day the Customs and Border Patrol would decide how many people could come across the border to ask for asylum in the first place. And if those numbers were exceeded, which they were, of course, every day, they would be sent back across the border. And what happened is that there was this sort of informal list called La Lista that was put into place by the asylum seekers themselves. And so people put themselves on the list and then were required to wait in Mexico just to have the opportunity to ask for asylum in the first place at the border. And then in addition to that, the Trump administration also put into place another policy called Remain in Mexico. And the Remain in Mexico program says once somebody has had the chance to ask for asylum, they are then told they must remain in Mexico to await their administrative asylum hearing, that they can't come into the United States, as had been done previously, to wait there.
Are any of these policies, like the Remain in Mexico policy or the list that people were getting put on, are any of those lawful under U.S. law?
That's a really good question. There's a lot of advocates and a lot of litigation around that issue. So advocates have taken the position that those policies aren't lawful, that the Remain in Mexico policy, that the idea of turning asylum seekers away, that Congress has never put a quota or a limitation on the number of people who can seek asylum, who can actually ask for asylum in the United States. And so that's been one of the main arguments, is that the administration is putting into place restrictions on asylum that Congress never intended when it passed the statute that provides for asylum, the Refugee Act of 1980.
And how do you think that this administration's policies and innovations have affected like the hostility towards immigrants, and how does that compare to past or historical U.S. policies towards immigrants?
So in the past, what the United States would do is to have asylum seekers come to the United States, apply for asylum, and then they would provide asylum seekers a notice of a court hearing, basically the same way that we would do in any other civil case. And the person seeking asylum would then be in the United States preparing for their asylum hearing and come to court and have their cases adjudicated at that point. So under the Bush administration and then later on under the Obama administration, those administrations started to detain asylum seekers. And so that was kind of the next restriction that was placed on asylum seekers. The Trump administration has taken this big step forward by saying asylum seekers, you can't come to the United States at all until these policies have been complied with.
And what do you think are some of the implications of waiting in Mexico? Like, what do you think about the policy of having people wait in Mexico instead of being put into detention centers?
Yeah. So if someone is detained in the United States, even if they're even if we do choose to detain asylum seekers, the protections for someone in detention who's seeking asylum include the ability to ask an immigration judge for release on bond, right, to prove that they're not a danger to the community or a flight risk, right, unlikely to show up for a court hearing. And we know from studies that asylum seekers in the United States do tend to show up for their asylum hearings. So in that situation, even someone who is in detention in the United States is able to ask for release from an immigration judge. If they are in the Remain in Mexico program on the other side of the border, they don't have that opportunity. And one of the things that we were learning from the clients that we worked with and that other attorneys have been finding across the border is that people who are in Mexico have often actually been in danger as a result of that requirement to remain there, because having been in one place in some of the more dangerous areas of Mexico, they've been vulnerable to cartels, gang members who were seeking them in their home countries were able to find them in Mexico. So there's just a much higher level of danger there. And there was one attorney who reported that a third of her clients had been kidnapped, or their family members had been kidnapped while they were in Mexico.
That's really terrible. Can you tell me a little bit about what kind of work we were doing there?
Yes. Yeah. So the students who I was working with were actually doing a number of different things. One of the most important things for clients who arrived was to make sure that the documents that they had that could ensure that they could prove that they were the parents of the children that they were with, or could prove their asylum cases. They were physically carrying those documents right throughout their journey. And so one of the most important things that the organization Al Otro Lado was doing, along with the Innovation Law Lab, was ensuring that those documents would actually be uploaded safely to the web, so that when they arrived on the other side of the United States, or if there was a question about parentage of their children and family separation, those documents were safe. That was one of the most critical things that the students were doing. The other one was providing information and guidance about the legal requirements since there was no access to asylum due to changes in law that the Trump administration had made, making sure that they had the ability to understand how to apply for withholding of removal or protection under the Convention Against Torture. So some of that work that we were doing was providing that kind of information and guidance, and also talking with them about the process that they were about to experience in Mexico and in the United States itself. So just having a sense of what the process was that they were about to be going through, what they could expect when they spoke with the border officials, the possibility of detention, how to keep from being separated from their children, were critical to people's understandings of what might happen and to their ability to bear what was ahead of them, because they had a better understanding of what the process was.
Since most people who were waiting there were families, how do you think that the administration policies have affected families as a whole, and in particular children?
Yeah, so if you think about the metering policy and the Remain in Mexico policy, those imposed tremendous wait times on people. So metering could take from 6 to 9 months. Mm-hmm. Remain in Mexico, right, once they came back from actually applying for asylum, could take another 9 months to a year of waiting. And in the meantime, children don't stop growing. And they don't stop developing. They don't stop needing to play. They don't stop needing education, stable family situations, friendships, and school. So during all this time that the families are in stasis with respect to their lives and their immigration cases, the children are continuing to have these kinds of developmental needs and not getting them.
It'd be really tough. And why do you think that it's important to bear witness to these policies in action versus studying them?
So I am a scholar, and that's mainly what I do. But I felt compelled to go to the border and see for myself, what the situation was at the border. Because I think until you're there and you're talking with somebody who's being impacted directly by the policies that you've been hearing about and studying, it's really impossible to understand what that impact is. Mm-hmm. So one of my first conversations was with somebody who I told was not going to be able to access asylum because of the Trump administration's cutting off of the kinds of asylum claims that Central Americans can bring. And his question was, if I'm able to get withholding of removal, how do I reunite with my family who are back in Honduras? Well, the answer to that is every member of his family has to independently and individually prove that they are eligible for withholding. So there was no way for him to, having obtained it himself, to help his family through his own, protection. To reunite with him, despite the fact that they were in the same danger and related to him. So it is theoretically possible for him to obtain withholding of removal, for his wife to obtain withholding of removal, and one of his children not to. And that itself is a form of family separation.
Yeah. Great. Well, thank you. I really appreciate your time and doing this interview with me.
Thank you, Mara, and thank you for everything you did.
Thanks.